Hi everyone. Thanks for coming to the science section right after lunch. So I'm Serena, and I'm a current 2016 scholar from Hong Kong and currently at St. Catherine's. I'm doing a DPhil in zoology, so focusing on like gene evolution and stuff like that. Zoologist, see you there. And so today we're very honored to have Bethany with us. So Misery and Keble, 2004, a professor of planetary science at Caltech, and a research scientist at NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory. So the physicist, I know you might want to talk with her afterwards.
Geologist, actually, but I hang out with physicists.
I see. I know physicists in the audience. So, and then we have Caroline, Delaware and Merton, 2010, a bioethics fellow at the National Institutes of Health. And there's Astrid, Quebec and New College, 1987, and Chief Science Officer and Physician at the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Sciences and SickKids. And then we have Pamela, who Kansas and Wadham, 1993, Associate Professor at the Department of Human Ecology at the State University of New Jersey. Okay, so so basically for this session, I will be going through a bit of like giving these speakers some opportunities to like share a bit of like their educational progress through this field and what it was like to have the careers that they had, and I'll monopolize this microphone for 35 minutes about that and then open the floor to everyone. So just to start off, so would it be possible for the speakers to share a bit about like why you decided to enter the science sector? Why did you like go for the degrees that you've had? Yeah. So do you want to start with?
I get to start?
Yeah.
The benefit is sitting next to you?
Yes.
All right, fabulous. So my background is I've always been interested in the natural world. I think this started really early in my life with watching like nature documentaries on television programs and like loving it. And also I had a beautiful backyard to explore in Tallahassee, Florida. But when I applied to undergraduate colleges, I checked the boxes I checked, you know, when I said, what information are you interested in receiving? It was things like astronomy, ecology, geology, environmental sciences, international relations, political science, urban planning. So I think the message is I was interested in both complex natural systems and complex human systems. I was fortunate enough, and what attracted me to the particular undergraduate institution I went to, Washington University in St. Louis, is that they had an integrated program in environmental science where you could do whatever major you want, and I did earth and planetary science. But then you also took a series of clustered, like cross-disciplinary courses in things like environmental ethics, English and environmental literature. We did some scientific case studies of like the establishment of the Mojave National Preserve and the park system. So it was sort of this multifaceted, both science and policy program that drew me in. I had the amazing opportunity after I started working in a remote sensing lab, so that's the use of satellite imagery. I started working with a professor who was in charge of that program summer after my freshman year. I stayed in that lab. It was a great group of grad students, undergrads, doing fun different things with satellite imagery of Earth and of the Moon and of Mars and of Venus. So that's how I got involved in the whole NASA side of things. And I was incredibly fortunate that I was ahead on my coursework. And so senior year, when the Mars rovers Spirit and Opportunity were going to be landing on Mars and that January, my professor asked me, so we need some help with this mission, and you basically completed your course requirements. Would you want to spend the last semester of your senior year out at the Jet Propulsion Lab, like operating rovers? Yeah. So that is in fact what I did with the last semester of my senior year. Now, I had been elected as a Rhodes Scholar in November, and the course I had chosen to read at Oxford was actually more on the environmental side of things. It was environmental change and management, and it was fundamentally a policy degree back on that complex social system side of things. And so I studied the policy here. It was actually not as challenging as I expected it to be. It was sort of a repeat of some of the things I'd learned in undergrad, so I took those things like economics that I hadn't gotten appreciation for in undergrad, but I missed science, and I decided that if I was going to enter in the policy world, I wanted to do it as Dr. Bethany Ehlmann, scientist, and make my impact that way. So I went, stayed here, did a second research master's in physical geography with an awesome woman who's now head of department in geography, Dr. Heather Viles. And then I went back to the States and did a PhD, but I did it in planetary sciences, having been bitten by that bug of space exploration from that early experience. So now I'm a professor at Caltech. I do a lot of my research as planetary exploration, but I also work with engineers and physicists and others to design instrumentation to do remote sensing that operates across all the planets. So that's my path. Cool.
I have to start with a disclaimer that the views expressed are my own. They do not reflect the views of the National Institutes of Health, the Department of Health and Human Services, or the US federal government. So with that out of the way, so last night after dinner, we heard a lot of people talk about how their experiences became art. I tended to use more of my experiences and turn them into scientific research. So I got interested in brain and cognitive science, which is the degree that I did at MIT when my grandmother was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease at the time that I was 13. And so all throughout high school, I took a lot of science and math courses. And then I really enjoyed doing brain and cognitive sciences at MIT, worked in a neuroimaging lab. I actually got to work with functional magnetic resonance imaging when I was 20 years old. Somehow they trusted me to operate the machine on my own. Still not really sure how exactly that happened. But that was a really interesting experience. But the part that I liked the most about it, when we were looking at the localization of language, was the applications of how they might help kids with dyslexia. Because we also partnered with the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and they would take the things we were learning and writing up in scientific papers and try to translate them to strategies in the educational world. So I really liked the real world implications of the things that we were doing. And the other major activity that I did at MIT was starting the campus chapter of Camp Kesem, which is a summer camp for kids whose parents have cancer. And so in the process of starting that nonprofit, we had to build partnerships with hospitals, do a lot of fundraising through grant writing and personal solicitations, recruiting volunteers and training them. Most of all, working with campers and their families. And so you'd hear a lot about the social side of cancer. So from things such as parents not being able to pay for birthday presents for their kids, to the mother who cried on my shoulder one year because she wasn't sure whether she'd be alive to see her kids grow up. And it turned out she had a BRCA mutation, so a hereditary breast cancer. And she wasn't sure whether her kids should be tested for this. And at the time, the insurance policies actually didn't have a lot of guidance on this. There weren't a lot of guidelines in policy either. And so I looked at that more closely and then decided that's what I wanted to apply to do for my Rhodes Scholarship. And so that's the project that I worked on here when I did my DPhil in public health. So I looked at the ethical and policy implications surrounding access to care for hereditary breast and ovarian cancer. And I guess one other thing that I did at MIT that really shaped my interest in policy was interning for Senator Kennedy, actually right before he died. So you got to answer lots of calls from constituents who had questions about healthcare, were really concerned about what their access was going to be. I also worked a lot on women's issues, and sometimes answered questions about Social Security. So really seeing the human side of a lot of things, and then wanting to address some of those kinds of questions. And so the way that I ended up doing that was through my degree in bioethics here. So it's DPhil in public health, but really with a public health ethics group. So looking very closely at patient-centered care and the kinds of questions that we can help clinicians and patients use in order to make better decisions. And then on a personal note, when I was in my third year here, I actually had a catastrophic accident. And so I ended up with a lot of neurological and vascular damage. And so I actually had to leave in the middle of my third year and finish writing up my DPhil from home. In between having different vascular and neurological surgeries and whatnot. So finally finished that, but then was in sort of the throes of having really complex management of chronic pain. And at the same time as I was dealing with these things, the United States was also starting to see this ratcheting up of people with chronic pain, so estimated to be as many as 100 million. And on the other side of that, also seeing a lot of questions about opioid use disorders. So seeing, 33,000 people in 2015 died of those. So I was also then in the unique position of having been treated as a chronic pain patient myself, in some cases with opioids, and then also recognizing the much broader societal issues. And so that's what I applied to do for my postdoctoral fellowship at the NIH. And so those are the questions that I work on right now, trying to think about who should be saved and what kind of resources can we allocate to that. what kinds of skills do we need to teach clinicians in medical school and afterwards, and how do we empower patients to make better decisions about their care that don't involve things that can become addictive.
I'm Astrid Guttmann. I'm a pediatrician. I'll start with where I am and then sort of go talk a little bit about the trajectory, which is kind of a lesson for anybody that you can, get to places, even in the world of science, which is a world that I think values deep expertise in general, through many different routes. So I'm a pediatrician, and my research is in the realm of health services and health policy. I work at an institute that was founded by another Rhodes Scholar whose wife is sitting somewhere. I think I saw Elsa come in there. She is David Naylor. So I work at a research institute that looks at the health system sort of writ large. In Canada, our health systems are provincial, and David had the great insight to say to the Ministry of Health, by the way, you collect a lot of data while you're, just running the healthcare system. Why don't we bring that all together? If you have questions about the health system, we'll have, good analysts and smart people who can, do that. And by the way, the rest of the time we're going to do what we would like to do with those data. And it's a research institute that started very much around the healthcare system, but now we really are trying to move towards informing many of the other kinds of policies that have a huge impact on health, so all of the social determinants of health. And so I'm now the Chief Science Officer, and part of what I do now is actually try to negotiate and convince other policymakers that actually it's really helpful to know, which families are on social assistance when you start to think about health, and which, who is housed and not housed. We negotiate with the federal immigration ministry that, again, it's very, when you link data from that, you can better understand trajectories of refugees and immigrants. And so a big part of what I spend my time doing is trying to broaden what we do, which used to be very focused around policies and healthcare policies, to being about sort of larger policies that influence health. So, and I say this for a couple of reasons. One is that, for many of you who sort of I think where you are housed professionally in science matters a little bit. And I was trying to think about some very practical tips where I think women's issues interact very specifically with science. And I do think the context is important. So I would say that my research institute is independent of the university. I have an appointment at the university. I'm a professor in a clinical department plus health policy, but I'm not a tenure track one. So it is a little bit different. And so some of the culture that I can sort of speak to is a little bit the academic medical culture, because that's partially what I'm in, but also an independent research institute. So, and maybe we'll get to some of those sort of practical tips later. In terms of my trajectory, super odd. I knew I wanted to be a doctor when I was a little girl, mainly because my dad was a doctor, and I had a lot of respect for him, and he was very happy, and honestly it didn't go probably much deeper than that. But I was actually much more of a liberal arts, so I majored in French and German history and literature as an undergraduate. I did my pre-med stuff on the side. When I came to Oxford, I did philosophy and theology. I sort of said I was going to do some medical ethics, that's what I put on my application, but honestly I was actually interested much more broadly. And I just sort of thought, if I'm going to be a doctor eventually in in more of the science, plenty of time for that, why not? And that was a little bit our generation who came here. I think a lot of us did second BAs, and that was really fun. I then had a little panic about going to medical school. I was interested actually in environmental policy as well. I'd worked in Washington, and all the people that I was surrounded with, none of them, a lot of them were lawyers, and a lot of them were, going straight to policy, and I became very influenced with that and thought medicine was probably the wrong track. Changed my mind again, did go to medical school, then did residency, and honestly this is years and years and years of, training. And then at the other end, ended up doing a master's in health policy. Still wasn't quite sure that it fit what I wanted to do, and then took a course in sort of this more applied health services research. Was mentored by somebody who's also a very good friend of Ilsa's, and I just sort of found this kind of area that I thought was very interesting, and found a place, so this institute where I work, that just, where I kind of went in there and met a few of the other people and just thought, these are my people, you know? They just were thinking about what was important in the healthcare system in the same way that I did, wanted to approach it from, you know, being able to do research to inform that. And it was just, you know, I just felt like almost immediately like I was with like-minded people, and I liked the culture of the place. And I think that's actually very important in terms of career trajectories, and whether or not you know, thrive actually. So maybe I'll leave it at that for now, but happy to sort of come back to some of those aspects.
Yeah, like a lot of people who end up in the environment field, I think as a young child growing up on a farm in Kansas, that environment, being out in nature, influenced me to stay with this field throughout my educational history. But I had sort of an epiphany. So I was an undergraduate science major at the University of Kansas, but I was also a political science major, and I was trying to balance between the sort of social and policy side of the environment and the more scientific side. And my major advisor as an undergraduate is a soil carbon guy, and so I was kind of leaning more towards that. And I got a Washington internship, like many people do when they're undergraduates, and one of the questions was, you know, who do you want to go work for? And at the time, our senators from Kansas were not really doing anything on the environment. This is like late 80s, early 90s. And I said, but there's a really interesting young senator who's just started some hearings on climate change, which was not a big issue. And it was becoming a big issue in the late 80s. And I said, I'd really like to go work for this young up-and-coming senator whose name is Al Gore. And so, you may have heard of him. And so I did. So I got to do my internship, even though I had no Tennessee connections at the time. And he had started doing hearings on global climate change in 1988. So I was doing my internship in 91, and so these hearings have been going on for a little while. And most of the hearings up to that point had been focused mostly on atmospherics, because the senator at the time was part of the science subcommittee that was called Space Science and Technology. And so most of his staffers were chemists, atmospheric physicists. They didn't have a biologist at the time, and after one of these hearings, Senator Gore turned to kind of nobody in particular, I just happened to be standing behind him, and he sort of speculated out loud, I wonder how important land use change is for climate change. Should we be thinking about that? And so I was just kind of sitting there, and I said, I guess we'll go figure that out, and that's what I've done ever since. So the sort of offhand comment just really struck me as something we needed to know about. And so I ended up, I went back to the University of Kansas. I did a senior honors thesis on how much burning of biomass contributes to concerns about global climate change. Ended up coming here, did an MSc over at Plant Sciences across the street. A course that you unfortunately can't do anymore. But since then, I've been really encouraged to learn that Oxford has all of these wonderful MSc programs now on biodiversity and environmental change, and those were not available in the early 90s. So it just shows you how much the world has come to recognize the importance of these issues. So I ended up going and doing a PhD at Yale, and I kept being pulled between these science and policy realms. I actually ended up, after I finished my undergraduate degree, before I came here to Oxford, which was 1992, Senator Gore had a new role, which was being part of the Clinton-Gore ticket, and so I went and worked at the White House for a year before I came here. And one of the things that which I loved working on environmental policy, and I had a wonderful mentor who was the head of the Council on Environmental Quality, who was Al Gore's longtime environmental aide, Katie McGinty. Some of you may know her. She recently ran for Senate in Pennsylvania in the US. So I was her assistant for many years, and wonderful role model, like how important it is to have women as role models. But one of the things I always had to do was basically go talk to scientists, like answer this policy question and go talk to the scientists. And I felt like I was like, you know, a mile wide, but an inch deep in some of the science policy. And I decided that I wanted to be the person that someone was going to call about some sort of policy. I wanted to be the expert. And so that's why I ended up going and getting a PhD and not staying in the political field. But I was always kind of pulled between the human dimensions and the natural science dimensions. So deciding to take a challenge, I did a PhD in 2 different departments. So I have a PhD in forestry, and I also have a PhD in anthropology. And so that sort of animated my work ever since. how do human decisions about land use and whether to plant forest or deforest, what are the global implications of that, and then vice versa. So if there's global climate change, how does that impact human decision making about what crops to plant and where to plant them and so forth. So I've kind of stuck with that ever since. And one of the things that I've been doing more recently that's kind of pulled me back into the policy side of things, and which I would really encourage folks to do, is there's a really important, I think, and strong move towards global science assessment panels. So probably the most well-known is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which meets and has basically reviews the state of the science on climate change. But there's another one, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, their equivalents in health and so forth. And these have been really important in moving the needle on some of the policy debates. And I think a lot of scientists for a long time, and I include myself in this, weren't sure if people are reading our papers, what's the impact of this? And these science assessment panels show you the immediate impact because governments are taking up these findings. And so I recently applied to be one of these expert scientists, and to my shock, I was actually accepted. So they take people of all sorts of backgrounds and so forth because they want to get a range. So it's not just like the world's expert on climate change or atmospheric chemistry. It's people like me who have an expertise in one small area, but when you accumulate all of us, we can then have these global assessments. So that's something a lot of people I think should think about as a way, if you're interested in that science policy interface, there are a lot of really interesting new mechanisms that we can use to stay involved in that, and I encourage people to do that.
Great, thanks. I just want to kind of like poll the audience, like currently who's like in doing a science-related degree or in like a science-related job sector? Just wanted to kind of check, yeah? Okay, so we know our audience. Thanks. And so basically talking about like education and STEM education overall. So currently I think all the UK undergrads that have a degree in engineering and technology, only actually 14% of them are female, while for veterinary sciences, 77% are female. So I just wanted to ask, did you ever feel like a minority doing your degree? And for the ones that did, like, say, a degree in theology and other, like, social science-related sectors, did it feel very different when you went into, like, medical school, or was it, like, the other way around? You felt there were more female students around you? Anyone who's interested?
I would say in my field, environmental sciences, it's now more female-dominated. I think at the undergraduate level, we have to be very clear about what level we're talking about. So this is very common at the undergraduate level in the biological sciences and the environmental sciences. Women are at parity or above, but then they start to drop out. So at the PhD level, I think it's still very close to about 50-50 for environmental and biological sciences, but at the assistant professor level, it starts to go to 40%. At the associate, it's like 30%. So it depends on how high you go up. And I think there have been a lot of very good studies that show a myriad of reasons for this. Some of it's related to childcare. I can speak to, because I've gone in a tenure track position in a public university, one of the reasons that we know that women drop out of the tenure track is because of childcare or because they're following a spouse. They may have married another academic and only one of them gets the job. That is changing, and so that's really encouraging. And so for folks that are coming up and thinking about academic science jobs, at least at public universities, there's enough pressure that those things are starting to change. And so both women and men can, for example, take a year off the tenure track, and so you get an extra year before you have to go up for tenure per child, and really encouraging men to take that as well. More and more universities will do spousal hires, and so you come as a team. And that, one of my pieces of advice is don't marry another academic. I have married another academic, and so we have had to go through 2 rounds of getting 2 jobs at a university, and luckily that is changing because people realize if you want to have good women, oftentimes women scientists are married to other male scientists, or they have domestic partnerships with other scientists, and so you need to have both of them, and so that's changing in terms of job packages. So I think it's going to be better because of those structural things, but there's no doubt that it still exists, problems.
So I'll echo some of this in our field. So, my primary primary field of pediatrics is very female dominated. I work in a very enlightened, very large children's hospital, but where you start to see amongst those of us who do science, the differences are certainly those who choose to do research and those who become research leaders. On the other side, in the sort of health policy, my research institute, I'd say it's a little bit more balanced, but again, I think there's some, sort of key areas where there are differences. And I think one that's really important to talk about, so there was some talk this morning about, transparency and salary. So I think Anne mentioned that. So I would completely, so salary is definitely one thing, but in science, your operating money is also a big deal. And, I would say that there's pretty good evidence that, institutions that are more transparent about salary, and you're coming in and there's a grid and there's clear ways in which people's performance is assessed and the implications for pay tend to do better. So again, thinking about the kinds of institutions you may want to be in or the questions to ask, that's one thing. I think the startup packages for labs is a complete dog's breakfast, and everybody negotiates their own thing. And again, I think that's one where, like, my practical suggestion to people who are more junior, I didn't do any of this, I didn't even know that these things were like a thing, but the way I kind of talk to people I mentor is, like, you've got to ask people. And some institutions are better, you're setting up a lab and they're clear, we give everybody 3 years of this until you get your grants, but a lot of people, a lot of places, it's this, one-on-one negotiation, and all the people that I know at their institutions who have asked around, it's pretty clear that women do not negotiate as well. And it's not that institutions, I'm now in a position where I hire people. We want to hire people and we want to set people up for success, right? So it's not like, and again, I think, we all kind of, you go to school for a long time, and I think you work in fields where, the person who's like 20 years ahead of you is the expert, and you feel like you'll never get there. And, so I think a lot of people end up, when they're applying for jobs, first jobs at least, feeling like you're just happy that somebody's gonna, give you a job, which is not the right attitude to have, because honestly, as institutions, we do want talented people, and we want to set you up for success, but then translating that into what you actually really need and what are other people getting to sort of set themselves up in science is really important. So that's just like a practical thing that as you think about, negotiating jobs, find out what other people in those institutions, or have your, and it's not as hard for you to ask, but, figure out who can figure that out for you. And I think that's very, very important. So, because I think that is one area where, it's not a glass ceiling, but where I think there are big differences that make a difference to how successful you're going to be, and that's within universities, research institutes, etc.
So actually, I remember one thing, since we mentioned a lot about science and like policy here. So one thing that I remember when I was going for the Hong Kong Rhodes scholarship stuff was my science professor actually pulled me aside and asked, like, are you sure you want to go for the Rhodes? Because they're kind of like, all that leadership and like policy stuff. I mean, you're gonna do research, right? So it was kind of like a scientist and the leader. It was like, they couldn't really put it into the same context. Couldn't understand that. So, do you have any like further comments on like for young scientists, say, who are also interested in this cross-discipline stuff? Like, I want to take my work out and kind of like apply it to the real world. Like, how would you kind of encourage them and like break down the stereotype of a scientist working alone in a basement?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of feel strongly about this. The answer is just do it. Do what you want to do. I mean, in science, right, the currency of the realm is sort of papers. So you need to publish, you need to do good work. But that's kind of, in my opinion, that's actually insufficient. Like, the other things that you need to do is you need to talk about your work and to talk about your work broadly and to hopefully make the connections between the work you're doing and the work that other people are doing. And that's actually how your work truly gains influence, is by that conversation and by that making of connections. I also sit personally in a field where it's not impossible, but you have to be a certain flavor of modeler and creative thinker to make progress on your own. sitting in your own lab or at your own computer or whatever. Because I do space exploration, space missions, Earth remote sensing, I mean, we're talking about the projects to collect new data cost tens of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars. Like to send the last rover to Mars, the Curiosity rover, it's $2.5 billion spent over approximately 10 years. And so you have to work with other people. It is not an option to sit in the lab alone. And so something that's been really interesting to me as I've gone from student to assistant professor, and then I just got tenure in May, is seeing the role that as I move through, both because of my science, but also because of actually actively seeking to get involved, the role that I'm starting to play in setting what the next missions are, either by writing proposals for these like billion-dollar missions, or by being an advocate at NASA headquarters, at community scientific meetings where we prioritize, well, what are the priorities of this field for the next decade? And you need leadership. You need leadership. You need the ability to build consensus. You need the ability to sit with someone over coffee or a beer and talk about what they want, what you want, whether there's a meeting, whether you go your separate ways, right? To collaborate versus to compete. Like all of this is essentially a people skill and requires leadership. And I wanted to sort of backtrack on something I said. So I had mentioned that my MSc in environmental change and management was maybe a little replicate of my environmental studies degree as an undergrad. It wasn't quite what I expected. But one of the things that was incredibly valuable about that is because the main course of lectures wasn't as amazing, as I purposefully took things I didn't really know anything about, like economics, macroeconomics, how that works, participatory governance. And I think that social sciences background and how like large-scale economics work and how to gain and build consensus in communities has actually been an incredible soft skill to have as I navigate this scientific landscape as well of thinking about what the science priorities are and trying to get other people to agree with me about what research directions to pursue. So that's actually been a lot of fun, and I've found myself drawing on this time at Oxford a great deal, especially the more senior I get.
Wonderful.
I'm obviously in a much more junior position than the rest of the panel. But I guess for me, in terms of thinking about what public impact the work that I do has, it comes back to why I wanted to do the work. And looking at healthcare doesn't really help anyone if you're only publishing it in academic journals that very small number of people actually have access to. And so getting out and trying to create practical tools for physicians to use or for patients to use is a really important aspect of the work that I do in my bioethics group. And I think also just picking a place that has an emphasis on public impact, or at least asking about that when you're applying places, finding out whether they're okay with you doing engagement and what kinds of things are permitted in your role and what aren't, particularly because I was looking at government internships and fellowships and whatnot, and so finding out what the limits of that were. And then I think in particular using some of the data skills that I gained from doing brain and cognitive science. I use neuroimaging in my work now, and it actually does make it easier to bring it to other fields too, when you can say, yes, here's a theoretical argument, because I do work with a lot of philosophers, but here's also the underlying reasons why we think this works based on either the data that I've gathered from doing qualitative interviews, or here's the neuroimaging work that we have that shows how the brain works when people are in chronic pain or are addicted to opioids. And it makes a much stronger package when you can speak across different fields by using tools from those different fields.
Can I pick up on something that... So just what Bethany was talking about, so this is more about the fact that science is no longer, nobody's doing science alone in their base, in their own lab. And I would say that, I think everybody acknowledges that, but institutions have, there are institutions that are better at officially acknowledging that than others. So there are still places where the model is, the PI, right, the principal investigator in their lab, and honestly, really good high-impact science doesn't happen that much anymore. And honestly, and this is where it kind of aligns, I think, with some of the things we've been hearing about in terms of some of the challenges that maybe, I don't think are totally specific to women, but are certainly, more prevalent, which is that, institutions that value like the one PI and you have to be, the grants are in your name and you're working and you're the one that we acknowledge as driving something. Like, it's not good for science, but it's certainly not, good to foster collaboration. The bottom line with doing science is, funding, there are these peaks and troughs, right? And you want to be in a place where if there's just a little bit of a trough in your own sort of grant funding, that you're working with people who, you know, if your collaborator has money, good, then you can use it, and you're doing projects with them, and they can still be, you know, you can still be the first author and get some of that sort of academic, you know, do what you're supposed to do to be a good scientist and, you know, build your academic credibility, but that you're not so vulnerable to, you know, what is, I think, pretty inevitable. I don't know all of the sciences so well, but certainly in our field, you know, there's there's politics about how things get, you know, who's funding research and all of that. And so I think if you can find a place where, you know, there's a bit of a long-term view where it's not just one person who's getting attributed for the science, that I think is quite helpful. The other comment I would make just about the policy thing too is, I think you can still, I think there are ways to be a really good and deep scientist. And again, you may think, you know, and your science may be incredibly relevant to the policy realm, but it doesn't mean that you have to be the one that translates it. So some people have great, you know, skills at both, and I think I'm sitting with people like that. But we also, like, as our, you know, our researchers, we have 240 scientists, and some of them who do the best science, honestly, they are not the best ones to go meet with the policy people. And so we take that on as an institution, and we build capacity. So partially we build capacity, like, in the way we communicate. So a paper goes out, but we do an infographic, right? And the infographic is much more what we, you know, we're tweeting that out, and that's what, you know, we release. But we also just have people who, you know, again, people have different skills, and there are some people who are better at translating a large body of science for a policymaking audience or a public audience than others. And so I don't think you need to feel burdened that your science won't be relevant if you don't want to be the one, because it's really time consuming actually to do some of this sort of policy translation stuff. But if you work in a place that, again, has people who do it, your work is getting out there in the appropriate ways, but it doesn't have to be you. Like, you can, if you love your science and you want to be in the lab, go for it, because we still, I mean, that's still what we're trying to translate out, right? So I think you don't want to feel like you have to, it's not like an individual sport, you know, that's sort of a game. Like, research is a major team sport, and anyway, so.
Yeah, I mean, this is something I've constantly been thinking about. How do you translate the things that you're doing into some sort of policy relevant field? And I actually had a very similar experience to yours, Serena, in terms of when I was an undergraduate. I think a lot of people who end up as Rhodes Scholars know the Truman Scholarship and the Goldwater Scholarship. They're kind of like feeders for a lot of Rhodes folks. So the Truman is the one in the US for public policy, and the Goldwater is the big national one for science students as undergraduates. And so they both have foundations in Washington, DC, and so forth. And so I applied to both. Like, I couldn't decide. I thought, like, these both sound really good. And I got both. And I was the first one who had done that. And so the two foundations they were like, can she take both? Like, they had to talk to one another. It was just, like, so strange that, like, a scientist would want to do policy and a policy person would want to do science, and what's going on. And a ton of people, I'm really glad to say, have done both since then, so it's totally fine to do. But at the time, it was like, you know, there was such a division. And so it sort of shocks me that your advisor, even today, was saying that this is something that's not for us, you know, the science is maybe this isn't the place for it. So I'm glad that you are here and that you didn't let that dissuade you, because I think the models for it are long-standing now. And the other thing that I'm not great at this, I wish I was better at it, but social media is, I think, something that scientists are increasingly using to publicize their own research. And the one thing, if I had to impart any advice, so I don't have a huge social media presence. I have a fairly small one on Twitter, but I have reporters who follow me, and I'm not totally sure how they get a hold of me. In a few places I've reached out to them, and other times they've just seen a tweet or something that I wrote. And so it doesn't really matter. I think some people have huge followings, and that's great, because you have thousands of people listening to what you're saying about science. But if you get a few reporters, some of the key national reporters on climate and so forth in different countries that read your tweets, and then they'll go to you for background and say, do you know this person, who then you could refer them to your other science pals who work on mangroves or whatever else the reporter is working on. So that's happened to me in the last couple of years, that I've actually gotten my research in the New York Times. And I work on really obscure, I work on like forest carbon in Vietnam, right? Which is not something that your average person and the New York Times cares about, but it's because the reporter who could translate this really obscure stuff, I didn't have to do it. He was the one that said, this sounds really interesting, and I think there's an audience for understanding how important land use change is for global climate policy and so forth. So let me write the story, but you feed me some of the things that are interesting about your research. So just to reiterate, you don't have to be the sort of key person who can do either policy translating or media translating. Let those other people who have that expertise do it for you, but just make yourself accessible to it. And the reporters that I have interacted with have told me, which is really too bad, that a lot of scientists they reach out to either don't get back to them, because we're all busy in our labs and so forth, or get back to them and are just not really, they're just sort of skeptical of why the reporter is calling them, because they think that their science is too complicated or nobody's going to care about it and so forth. So if you do get calls from reporters, build a relationship and take advantage of that, because it may, end up in exciting changes to international policy that you hadn't expected.
Yeah, so this perhaps will be like the last question from me. So I was wondering, since we were talking about how you can translate your science, sort of like go to like the policy side, or like have people translate for you so you impact like the world around you, but at the same time a lot of policies are impacting science. So a few days ago, literally, while we were having a lab lunch, my supervisor and the neighboring lab supervisor got together to complain about Britain's new science and technology panel, on which only 2 people actually had PhDs and a background in research. So I'm just wondering, like, you've also mentioned like the need for like good institutions and infrastructure to like have good science going, but if we're like kind of not there yet, what do you think the scientists can do?
Object to the current state of affairs and contact some of the reporters that you've built relationships with on or off record, whatever you feel comfortable with. Because I mean, it is really all a discussion, right? These are all human institutions, and thus they can change. They changed for the worse in this case. Maybe with some advocacy, they can change for the better. I don't know. So I guess my advice almost universally is, don't stay silent and just upset about the situation. Try to figure out what proactive step it is that you feel comfortable taking. Now, of course, depending on what's going on, depending on your relative position of like power, whether you're a student, whether you're a tenured professor, like you'll feel different degrees of comfort with taking different actions, but do take some sort of action, would be my advice.
But I'll balance that off. So
Balance it
I
out.
think it's different to object to things that, where we were talking about this before. If you have somebody who, is basically, they want to gut science altogether, or they, it's starting, again, as we're seeing, kind of this, climate change, just isn't happening. I mean, this is not an interpretation issue. There are just facts on the table. But I would say that one thing, and I've learned this from working with people in the policy world, is that, unless you've worked there, I don't think we totally, so in a more rational policy setting, I think scientists, and again, I work with a lot of clinician scientists who are, take care of patient populations, and they are very, very passionate about those patient populations. A health policy person's got to think about all the patients, right? And when they're thinking about how they're allocating resources, and I think sometimes when individual scientists come with their advocacy, the policymaker's like, okay, but like, big picture, you're talking about, and again, I work in pediatrics, so kids with rare diseases, there are like 100 of them with this one disease in Ontario, and there are, 3 million people with dementia. So they've got that same budget, and so I think there is a little bit of a balance between, so I definitely think step up, but you also have to think a little bit about, your credibility and what you represent when you are bringing your views. And I think when you're bringing science to people, you know what you're bringing. Like this is the scientific evidence that I and others have generated. I think when you start to get into other areas, I think it gets a little bit more complex.
Yeah, and just to say, I think there is a difference between, for example, advocating for your particular thing,
Yep.
for example, getting more funding. I mean, that's a little, as you say, it's an issue of balance, but advocating in this case, for example, from a procedural aspect, like,
Right.
look, this committee on science needs to have some scientists on it. I think there's a difference in terms of, advocating when you're thinking broadly versus thinking narrowly.
Right, I mean, I think in this political climate there. I mean, in some ways it's kind of motivated me to want to do more in the policy field rather than less, because it seems like there's never been a stronger case for needing to have evidence-based science playing an important role. I mean, particularly in the United States, I hate for this to be US focused, but there have been really disturbing news reports recently that our grant funding agencies at EPA and NSF are going through science abstracts and telling folks not to use the words climate change in them, even though our research is clearly based on climate change. And that, I mean, through previous political administrations, there's always been sort of ups and downs in how much there was funding for climate change and how we talked about climate change, but it's never been the concerted attack that we've seen in the last 6 months. And it actually goes back a bit farther, and I would say for young scientists who are getting into climate change, feel that be prepared for some really vicious attacks, because there are folks out there who are using Freedom of Information Act requests in the United States to go after scientists' data, to try to undermine them in the court of public opinion, bring up frivolous lawsuits against them. Some of you may know Dr. Michael Mann at Penn State, who is a prominent climate scientist, and he has had to retain lawyers to fight against some of these lawsuits, trying to get access to his data, not to be used for scientific purposes, but to be used for humiliation purposes and so forth. And so there's actually a really important legal group that has now formed called the Climate Change Action Lawyers Group, where lawyers will pro bono represent climate scientists against these frivolous FOIA, Freedom of Information Act requests, and so forth. But they've been brought against, and it's mostly public universities. They've been brought against scientists, University of Arizona, Penn State, as I mentioned, other places. And so if you are a junior scientist coming up, I absolutely encourage you to stay engaged in policy, but have that in the back of your mind, ready to fight on these things, and there are allies for you that will help you fight on these things. But sometimes you may want to have that fight after you're tenured, to be honest, because this is the reality that scientists have never been more important, and they've also never been more under attack. And so you can fight from a tenured position better than you can from an untenured one. And so I hate to have to say it, but sometimes you may have to make that personal decision that you're fighting. The world's fight will wait for 6 years, and you'll get tenure, and then you'll fight twice as hard once you get tenure. That may be what you have to decide to do.
Great plan. And I think I'll be opening up to questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, just raise your hand. And you should have one.
Hey, it's Kathleen McLaughlin, Balliol 87 from Arizona. I just want to stay on that point. So, you think about climate, what's happening with the science there, Astrid vaccines and what's going on with people who think they cause autism and so on. In an age when emotion may be overruling logic, how do we make the world safe for facts and for science? You mentioned a couple of things, but is there a general conversation going on in the scientific community? Are people taking actions, and what can people do to help support that cause?
It's a big issue.
That's a great question. Yeah, Bethany, you were saying.
Yeah, because I made the mistake of saying it's a big issue, meaning I opened my mouth first and have to respond to the question. I don't know, it's a challenging question, and it's challenging in the sense I don't necessarily understand it fully. Like, I don't understand why necessarily there is this phenomenon of moving away from, or the politicization of science. I suspect that it has something to do with two current threads, one being a sort of general distrust of elites that possibly has to do with some of the economic disparities that we're seeing, and I think the other perhaps being the sort of the plethora of information sources out there now, especially on the web, and like how do you judge what is authoritative and what's not in terms of how you think about it. So I don't know. I mean, when I encounter in my own field like these kind of emotion-based arguments for why to do or not do something that just don't have any basis in reality. I mean, I try to engage with that on some level when I'm giving a public talk and be like, well, let's step back. Let's look at how it is. So this is the facts. This is how it is. And I try to engage on that when I encounter someone, at a dinner party or a cocktail party, and I try to engage with that individual to try to point them to some sources. But I think, I think that this is an issue that actually punts back to like critical curriculum, like much earlier in like schooling, and getting the middle school curriculum and the high school curriculum. And so everyone, even if they don't, go all the way to a PhD, really being more critical about evaluating news sources, understanding the process of science. So I tend to like want to punt the problem to earlier in life and improving our education system in terms of training people to think critical, like from the middle school level onward. But I think it's a thorny issue.
Yeah, I mean, it's one the scientists are having, which is a good thing, that we're trying to have that discussion. And so the science policy interface assessments that I mentioned, I mean, this is the very issue that they're grappling with. The IPCC has been under attack ever since its inception in 1992 for various, groups, either allied with fossil fuels and so forth. But they've basically responded by just saying, our job is to evaluate the science on the merits of evidence, and we're going to do this and stick to our agenda and just make sure the science is better and better and better, and where we have uncertainties, identify the uncertainties. And I'm encouraged somewhat. In some ways, I kind of see what's going on in terms of climate denial as sort of the last gasp. I hope I'm right. Because this has been going on for so many years in the United States in particular, but the rest of the world is beyond it. China is clearly beyond it. It's really a localized phenomenon, and I think if you actually look at levels of public support for climate policies when they're not called climate change policies, they're quite high. And so I feel like this is a sort of last pushback from people who are losing. And maybe that's a good sign that scientists need to keep doing what we're doing. And it's a call to arms for us to be better at what we're doing, because I think a very damaging episode for climate scientists was the well-known ClimateGate scandal that occurred here in the UK with the University of East Anglia. Somebody accessed their servers, stole all their climate data and all their emails, and made this big deal that climate scientists were basically cooking the data, which they weren't, but the sort of give and take that scientists have in their emails where they're trash talking other scientists. We all know that happens. That was sort of exposed to public view. And people took that as deception as opposed to how we actually advance things. We argue with one another. So I think scientists doing that in public, showing what we do, telling people what labs do. I mean, I especially feel this because I'm at a public university. So my salary is paid by the taxpayers of New Jersey. So I feel like if somebody's parent wants to come in and talk to me about what I'm working on, please do so. I feel like that sort of extra obligation to be public about it. But there's various places to do that. Again, like the New York Times has had a recent series of online columns where they're like, follow a scientist for a day. Like, what does this scientist do? And just, what do you do in the course of your day? I think that sort of exposure is really useful because it tells people that scientists are not like these people hidden in a basement and we don't know what they're doing and it's very obscure. There was a great Twitter hashtag about 6 months or so, and I don't remember what the exact hashtag was, but it was like somebody had found a statistic that most Americans, at least, did not know a living scientist. Like they could name Einstein, they could name a few famous names, but like somebody who was alive doing science, they knew like maybe 1 or 2 people. And so people on Twitter were tweeting out like, I'm a scientist, this is what I'm doing right now. I'm eating my breakfast at my lab and I'm about to go do this. And it just sort of humanized the work they were doing. And I don't know if that's going to move the needle very much, but I like that idea of public engagement by scientists themselves, and it takes us out of our comfort zone. Like a lot of scientists, like I'm a huge introvert, I hate it, but I force myself to do it because I think it's important, and I hope more folks do that.
Well, on a more micro scale, just because you brought up the vaccine, so there's actually now science that has explored why people are anti-vaccines and what you do about it in a clinical setting. And what's very clear is what you don't want to do is be like, oh, and you're wrong, and you've got to, but what speaks to people are anecdotes. I mean, so again, they're reading the other anecdotes, and you tell them about that child that had meningitis, right? I mean, that's, that brings it home. And so again, I think actually, sort of multidisciplinary science is helping us understand why people hold some of these attitudes, and also is sort of very practically helping us, guide how you. Now that's on a one-to-one basis, but there's, I think interesting work and to be done. So.
Also, just at the NIH, I guess we were the subject of a Discovery Channel documentary series called First in Human, and so basically they followed around patients who were there for like a stage 4 cancer or for immunotherapies. Some of the people whom my group worked with, and so you actually got to see how the scientists really interacted with the patient at the personal level too, in addition to thinking about all the things that they spent time doing at the cellular level. So I think it's a lot of things like that, and saying yes to some of the public engagement things, and maybe we're a little bit more restricted because we're in the government system, but even the fact that we were able to do that, I think hopefully puts the fact that we care about science, we care about facts, but we also care about people, I think, out there. And I think in some ways we're also seeing that, this may be not true for climate change, but we do have bipartisan support for a lot of the health research that we do. So twice now we've had proposed cuts, and twice Congress has come back and increased our funding by a couple $2 billion, which is quite a bit actually when you look at our normal budget. So there is support for certain kinds of research, and hopefully it will continue on in that vein.
Yep.
So my name is Nanda. I'm got concussion, so just forgive me. I fell yesterday on the stairs. So I was at Trinity and I work for the Medical Research Council. So just to reiterate what you just said, we go to schools and we ask people to draw what they think a scientist should look like. It's always a guy with long hair, with glasses and a white coat. And what's missing is role models, women role models. Why are there so few women in science? And here we have role models, and what are we doing about actually promoting it? We don't really promote ourselves. Ladies and women, they like to stay back, and we don't actually promote, and that's something that's missing. And as you rightly said, public engagement, that's the only way we can get around to changing policies. So just to give an example, animal rights. When I was doing my DPhil here, I think they still do on Fridays, there's cakes outside, like no animal research. And it's changing now. The way we do it is going to schools, talking to the public about working with animals. I mean, there are some of the greatest discoveries that we do, medicines, would not have been possible without testing it on animals first. Of course, animals have rights, so we totally do it ethically, at least in this country, with the Home Office permissions. But the public don't know that. All they see is these people saying you're doing horrible things to animals, and you shouldn't be doing it. And yet when you're sick, any antibiotics you take, across in the pathology, the penicillin was only discovered by giving it to the animals which were sick. So we got to tell it to them. So I think people should be sort of more encouraged to go and talk to people. So we had Radio 5 come to our labs and actually see what work we do. And then we had people ringing in and they were saying, it's horrible what you do to animals. And we were showing them that actually we don't. We do need these models, but we have to do what we do so that people will have a better lifestyle and a better life, actually. So I just wanted to sort of say great things that you're doing, and you're sort of actually telling to the world. We shouldn't be shy of telling it what we're doing. And if everybody took that mantle and told people what we do, it would certainly change people's perception. And that's how we could have actually influenced the policy making as well. So now in this country, at least all the councils are getting together, and we have UKRI starting in April. So all the councils will be under one aegis. So we'll have a good chance to take our policies and make changes to it. And I totally get those people who are making policies are not even science trained, which is really sad. But the only way we can do it is get scientists such as myself. I've moved from doing actual bench work research into doing policies now and talking to people, engaging with the public. I think, when you think you've done enough at the bench, I would encourage people to go and to make changes to the world. That's the only way we can do it. So keep up the good work.
Thank you.
We bring up a really good point, and we've had a lot of, actually quite a bit of Canadian research on this whole, how do you get research into, evidence into policy, and it's very clear, we can push it out, but you also need good receptor capacity, and that's the words that they use. And honestly, it's a lot easier if you do have people who are doing policy who have been researchers themselves, and they don't need to be, again, they don't need to have been a Nobel laureate level, kind of scientist. I mean, even, if they just, even as an undergraduate, did some science or understand how to read evidence, can be very helpful. Because again, policies are influenced by a lot of different things. So we always just think, evidence-based, like we're like just happy if it's evidence-informed, right? Like did they at least consider the evidence? Because there's a whole bunch of other values and, other constraints that, politicians and policymakers are working under. But it's at least our role, I think, to sort of get it there. And I think to have people who
know that side and then work on the inside, you know, is definitely very, very helpful.
I want to pick up on an aspect of what you said about role models, the male scientist with the lab coat and the crazy hair. I've thought about this a lot because I really enjoy giving public talks and doing that kind of engagement work. In fact, like I think I wrote some little sentence blurb about Carl Sagan in my Rhodes application essay, and so maybe that's what I want to be. I don't know. There's interesting aspects though to how much of a public face of science to be that I think. And maybe there's some gender aspect involved as well, but how much to self-promote, right? Because that's kind of what you need to do to get that position. It doesn't feel comfortable, but it's something that you need to do. It also takes time. And so you could do that additional calculation or program those 50 lines of code or whatever, debug them. Or you could take that hour and prep a public lecture. Or you could make a decision. I have a kid's book coming out pretty soon, Dr. E's Solar System. There's a woman superhero with her sidekick rover who's telling kids 8 to 12 about her rover out on Amazon starting in January. That was my first book plug publicly ever, and I'm doing it because I need to self-promote, right, in order to get more women in science out there. So it's a struggle. It's something that I don't know, I'd welcome any other advice on this because I'm not sure, it doesn't sit comfortably, but I think it's something that I feel like I need to do.
Well, I would just add this, Bethany and I were talking last night at dinner that there's a real move in the United States to get more scientists to run for public office. There is one person in the US Congress that has the science background right now, who is a physicist. And so no wonder that there's not evidence in policy making if people don't have that background. So there's actually a new political action committee in the United States. Some of you may have heard of it. It's called 314 Action after Pi. And it's to raise money to get women and scientists to at least run for office, because we all know that the big barrier, as we heard this morning in the plenary, to running for office is often fundraising and doing that self-promotion. And so this is meant to be a political action committee that will raise money for scientists. So if you're interested in donating to it, they are a great cause. If you're interested in availing yourself of it and actually running for office, that would be awesome too. So there are these new resources, and this has really taken off since the 2016 election in the United States. But to also have an international focus, I work a lot with scientists in Vietnam and other countries in Asia, and the barriers for them to get involved in policy are even greater than the ones we face in the United States. But one great thing that we've had in the US for them are fellowships to bring scientists from abroad and have them work in US federal government institutions with exposure to policy, to get skills which they then take back to their countries and try to advance that science policy agenda. So if you have friends or you yourself would be eligible for some of these, Fulbright does some of this, and the other big one is the Humphrey Fellowship. And so these are great for scientists abroad, and I would encourage people to sort of spread that widely, because it really helps them get that sort of training, whether they're women or not, but to get engaged in policy, to promote their science, to have that public aspect. And so I hope to God that these fellowships don't get cut under the current administration, but they're there for now, and we should avail ourselves of them.
We've spoken a lot about doing science in government research labs and... Can you start over? Just stop the recording now. Oh, okay. We've spoken a lot about doing science in government research labs and academia. I'd like to hear your perspectives about how startups are changing the way in which we do science. I think a good example would be SpaceX. Arguably, it might be a more exciting place to be a rocket scientist compared to your more traditional sort of jet propulsion lab or NASA if you want to do things fast, or you want to work on develop technology for cheap, or depending on what it is that you want to do. How are startups changing the landscapes, and do you think that it is a good idea to pursue a scientific career in startups as opposed to academia?
Let's see. Well, since you gave the SpaceX example, I guess I'll start, but I definitely cannot fully answer this question. So SpaceX has generated a ton of excitement, and rightly so, because it's this whole thesis that by reusing rockets and by sort of standardizing and putting under one roof aspects of the manufacture of rockets, that you can cut the cost by multiple factors. And it's fundamentally sort of a business and an engineering proposition. And it's attractive, it's exciting, lots of young people are going to work there. SpaceX often steals folks from JPL, and then JPL steals them back in a few years also. So there's a lot of swapping going on in talent, and it's a different working environment, and I mean, there's some really long hours apparently at SpaceX, to the point that of the non-sustainable sort. So that's a whole side conversation that we could go down. But to more to the point of doing science in a startup environment, at least in the space sciences, let me think if this is actually true. Yeah, I think it's pretty true that for what I do in the space sciences, there isn't really a startup that does science. Like SpaceX is more the engineering side of things. So if you're an engineer who wants to do a lot of build and test as you go, and SpaceX is proceeding perhaps with more rapidity. JPL is proceeding along a diverser portfolio of projects, so you just kind of have to choose it, but it's more of an engineering. I don't know if other people can speak more to science and kind of the creation of new knowledge part from a startup perspective. I can't really.
Yeah, I'm sure people in the audience may know more about this. I would say for climate, it's certainly a really exciting area that people are doing some really interesting things, particularly on the mitigation side. So, you know, just new technologies, how can we draw down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, all these sorts of things. And one of the things that I think is encouraging is that I think in this generation, there's much more flexibility for scientists to move between corporate startup settings and then back to academia and back. Like I think it used to be, you got on an academic track, and if you got off of it, you couldn't get back on. And there was sort of barriers to that. But I think as long, and I've seen this in the people that we hire, as long as you are publishing some of the things that you're doing in the scientific journals while you're working at startups and so forth, you're keeping your visibility, you're going to the academic conferences, then you can do both. You can transfer between both. And I think people bring in wonderful skill sets when they've been in the private sector that academia absolutely needs. And for too long, I think those of us in public universities didn't know enough about the financial side of things and the practical side of things. So that sort of intermarriage is fantastic, and I'm really happy that there's the ability to do that now. So I would encourage people, if that's what you're interested in, it's not a barrier to then maybe thinking about going into academia later.
I think the one thing I'd say, though, is to, if you are going to a company, know what their policy is on intellectual property and publishing, because that sometimes can be very restrictive, or it sometimes can be totally open, and it just depends, but you need to know.
Hi, I'm Hila Levy from Colorado, Exeter 2008. I want to get back to the point about role models, about the fact that people don't know living scientists, and the fact that the research shows that if you know somebody in a particular profession, you're far more likely to trust it, just like most people know a doctor or know a teacher, know a police officer, and therefore trust their opinions or what they do as a profession and value to society. So I'm a big believer in this idea of science diffusion, and that scientists, we are like molecules and we should be out there in the population and diffusing. And I wonder what your ideas are on how we can incentivize institutions and academics and researchers to actually quantify and monetize and value people who take time off to do outreach or to spend a certain amount of their year going out to elementary schools in the middle of the country, and not just the East and West Coast or in university centers, but in actually letting people meet a living scientist, a real person, not just on Twitter, but in a classroom. And also how we train our curriculum and how we train teachers and licensed teachers, because I feel a lot of states have different perspectives, at least in the US context, of the fact that many people are not trained scientists themselves teaching science, and so they don't have that ability or that credibility themselves, versus other countries like in the UK where you have a degree in that field and then get a teaching credential. And so how do we kind of change these institutional models so that we create a market and a space where it is financially worthy to go out and do this work as a teacher full-time or as a part-time sort of outreach person?
So I'll say something briefly, because we actually have at Rutgers a Center for Science Learning, and this is exactly some of the issues that folks there have been dealing with, which is, could we change, for example, tenure guidelines for assistant professors to get credit for doing work with schools and so forth. And one model that's actually worked for some of the public universities in the United States, again, I hate to make this US-centric, but a lot of the US public universities are land-grant universities, so they have a extension service attached to them, and so an extension service is like, gardening classes, all sorts of things to go out in the public. And so our Center for Science Learning at Rutgers has used the New Jersey Extension Service, which does things like 4-H and various things with communities to get the scientists out who's working on tomato genetics to go out and talk to the gardening class that is through the Extension Service. So that's one model that's actually worked really well in New Jersey. I don't know how much it can be replicated in other places that don't have that particular history. But I think there has been a shift in some places, and again, it's going to be us changing institutions from within, but also, moving with our feet to the institutions that support this. So places that would include in their tenure guidelines outreach. So if you have talked to 30 classrooms, that counts as much as a paper. And those places are rare, but they exist. And so there's different models, moving away from just strict tenure track to having research professors, professors of practice, professors of teaching. There's a lot more flexibility in how we identify academic tracks and so forth, and I think that's all to the good, that's going to help us bring more people in, retain more people within our institutions, but also do exactly what you indicate, which is we've got to get folks out there meeting scientists, having our science teachers in elementary and secondary school have more contact with the research that's going on. And so there's different programs that are trying to do that. A lot of science teachers get horrible propaganda from fossil fuel companies, and so I'd like to see us, our professional societies, counteract that. So why isn't the American Geophysical Society sending out 20,000 booklets about climate change? Why isn't the fossil fuel companies sending out disinformation? Like we have to do more, but there's models to do it.
I think one interesting model that I read about, and I can't remember quite where, was saying that as a condition of receiving public grant funding, you'd have to have a public outreach component to it. So that's one way to institutionalize it. And then I think one other interesting thing has been the explosion in how many places are doing research festivals and trying to get scientists, even at very low levels, so undergraduates putting together posters and whatnot, so giving female scientists a chance to present their work to the public, I think is starting at an earlier level to start them presenting earlier, but also to get kids and families engaged in the kind of work that's being done around their cities.
I think just related to this, and again, this is like for people who are sort of thinking about, where you're going to work, and jobs. So, I would say within universities, and this isn't only about doing teaching outreach, but just in general, doing other types of translation of your research. So again, at our university, when you go up for promotion, and this is again in the medical side, there's research, clinical, and then there's this creative professional, or education, and then creative professional activities. And in that, bucket of what creative professional activities, that could be, doing outreach about your research. It could be doing outreach about science in general. And there are institutions that, go from, having none of that to tolerating it to being actually quite supportive of people doing it. So I do think that there are places you can work that are going to value that kind of work a little bit more. I will also just iterate, there are sort of stages, maybe you don't want to take on, the president of the US when you're a first-year assistant professor. Again, there are also things that as you get more senior and you've made your own contribution, you are a credible scientist, you then may move on to do things where you're just, again, you're spending your time helping a lot of other people do their science, or you're in a position where your funding is set, your tenure, you feel like you've done your thing, and maybe you're the one, maybe be at that stage where you're taking on, really important initiatives like that as well. So I guess a little bit around, when you think about the kind of place you want to work, think about whether or not some of these other things that might be important to you in your career are acceptable. And then think a little bit about, at what point, are you going to take
take it on, so.
Yeah, I guess we have time for one last question.
I'm Hannah Tonkin, 2005, Balliol in South Australia. I'm not a scientist. I think one of the few people in the room who did not put their hand up. My question is, I had a number of peers when I was at Oxford who were scientists who were either very unhappy in their PhDs or DPhils rather, or went on to do postdocs, were then very unhappy and was a bit lost as to what to do at that point, or even a few years later. What advice would you have for people in science who aren't happy in terms of alternative careers where they can really put their scientific skills to use? Maybe science communication policy, startup, we've talked about some of them, but do you have any more advice for people in that situation?
Well, I think it depends. I think you have to figure out why you're unhappy doing science, because I don't know, there's at least one is you may not like, well, one is you may not actually like doing science and need to change your career and focus. That is totally valid and possible. Another may be that you don't like the research group or the research environment or the kind of ecosystem around you while you're doing science. That tends to be fairly common because especially when you're a student, you're sort of working directly underneath one supervisor, and if that climate is not good, it's really bad. It can be really bad. I've seen talented people leave PhDs because there was just a personality mismatch. Or it may be that you like a different type of science rather than what you're doing on. And maybe you like mathematical models and you're stuck pipetting chemicals in the lab, or vice versa. Maybe you're an experimentalist and you're stuck in front of a computer all day, or maybe you're like me and you love space exploration, but you wish you could go out and actually look at some rocks in the field occasionally, which I am able to do. Anyway, so I think it's like figuring out what are the things that are making me unhappy and what does it take to make me happy, and some real introspection and talking around to figure out which way to go.
And just to add to that, I mean, one of the big reasons why, and there have been studies on this, female scientists leave labs, this unhappiness that you're talking about is sexual harassment. And it's been a huge issue in the sciences in particular. There have been some really high profile cases at universities. Berkeley had an astronomer, a couple other places, where that model of the PI, and there were people under him and they were doing all of his work and he was sexually harassing them, and they felt like they couldn't get out of that, but he was their employer and their mentor and so forth. So a lot of that unhappiness is related to this horrific incidence of sexual harassment in science. And so the finding a good mentor is so important, and I definitely would not have continued on if I hadn't. And they've all been mostly male mentors along the way, and so kudos to them. I had folks here at Oxford who were just fabulous, like David Maberly, who is one of the world's preeminent botanists, was at Wadham when I was here doing my degree. And I remember thinking, this guy literally wrote the book on botany. I mean, he has a book called The Plant Book. Like, he wrote the book on botany. I don't have anything to say to him. But he recognized, here's somebody I just want to sort of chat with because I was so intimidated, and he ended up being a wonderful mentor. And so so much of it depends on personality, and it's such a shame to see so many good women in particular drop out of science because they didn't have that mentor. So for me in particular, mentoring young undergraduates in particular, we don't get that many graduate students working with me, but it's been hugely important for me, especially at a big public university like we are. It's very easy for women to kind of sit at the back of the classroom and not speak up, and so little things like, encouraging women to come see me during office hours if they don't feel like speaking up in class, or asking them to, hey, have you ever thought about doing an honors thesis? I've got a really interesting question that I don't have enough time to figure out. Could you come help me figure that out? And just trying to give back in that way that I didn't have the female mentors when I was coming through. And some of my undergrads have gone off to do wonderful things as a result of that. So and I'm sure all of us have, stories of things that we try to do to mentor, but I think it's such a fundamental part of being a scientist, and it's undervalued in how we're promoted, but I hope that everyone takes it to heart as such an important goal.
Just please join me in a great round of applause for all of them.